than any other country because they bid more of a price for it, higher insofar as the money.
George Foreman built his name on fear. In the 1970s, no heavyweight hit harder, no fighter sent men collapsing with the same cold efficiency. He was the destroyer of champions, the giant who turned contenders into cautionary tales. The world saw power, the world saw dominance. The world never saw the crack beneath it. That crack formed on a violent night in January 1973, when Foreman faced the one man he never wanted across from him. Joe Frazier did not just fall. He rose. Again and again. 6 knockdowns that looked like humiliation to the crowd but felt like terror to the man throwing the punches. Foreman walked out of Jamaica with a belt, but he also walked out with something darker lodged inside him. A resentment he carried for decades. A bitterness born from fear he never admitted in public. The rivalry with Joe Frazier never ended. It festered, and as Foreman's life approached its final days, he could no longer hold it in. In a moment of brutal honesty, he told his son what truly happened between him and Joe Frazier, the truth he had kept buried for more than 50 years before he died. George Foreman was born in 1949 in Marshall, Texas, and grew up inside the hard streets of Houston's Fifth Ward, a place shaped by poverty, fistfights, and a constant struggle to stay alive. As a boy, he ran with older kids, skipped school, fought anyone who challenged him, and drifted toward the kind of trouble that could end a young life early. He later admitted that he was not simply misguided, he was dangerous. Nothing motivated him, nothing slowed him down. Until the Job Corps program pulled him out of the streets and forced structure into a life that had never known it. That was where he first put on gloves. The power inside him, the same force that once caused chaos in alleys and vacant lots, finally became focused. Coaches recognized something rare. Foreman did not punch like a young prospect. He punched like a grown heavyweight. Within a short time, he rose from street survival to Olympic glory, winning gold in Mexico City in 1968, and stepping into the professional ranks with momentum very few fighters had ever possessed. Through 1972, he crushed every opponent placed in front of him. Fighters did not simply lose to George Foreman. They were overwhelmed. They were forced backward by a physical pressure that felt unnatural. Commentators spoke about his strength with the tone people normally reserve for natural disasters. And above all of this stood one man, the heavyweight champion, Joe Frazier. Frazier represented the part of boxing that Foreman feared and respected the most. He was shorter, smaller, but built like a relentless engine that never lost rhythm. His pressure was constant. His heart was legendary. His left hook had beaten Muhammad Ali in the fight of the century and had already carved his name into heavyweight history. If Foreman symbolized raw destructive force, then Frazier symbolized willpower that refused to fade. Foreman watched him closely. Facing Joe Frazier was not just another step toward the title. It was a confrontation with a fighter whose determination could outlast talent, power, and size. Deep inside, Foreman understood something that he would rarely admit. Joe Frazier was the opponent who forced him to confront his own fear. By the end of 1972, both men were heading toward the same destination, a collision that felt inevitable long before it was officially announced. January 22, 1973. Kingston, Jamaica. The night the heavyweight division held its breath, Joe Frazier walked in as the undefeated champion, a man who had beaten Muhammad Ali and carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders. George Foreman walked in with something very different inside him. Fear disguised as confidence, doubt buried under power. He had watched Frazier for years. The pressure, the rhythm, the left hook that came from nowhere and ended nights. Foreman knew that if Frazier ever pushed him backward even for a moment, the fight could turn into a nightmare. The bell rang, and all the years of anticipation tightened into a single truth. Frazier rushed forward with the same determination he had shown his entire career. Foreman met him in the center of the ring and threw punches that felt like falling concrete. The first knockdown came with shocking speed. Frazier tried to rise as he always did. Foreman waited with a calm expression and then dropped him again. And again. 6 times in total. Each fall heavier than the last. Each moment rewriting the reputation of both men. Howard Cosell's voice cut through the air as he shouted the words that became immortal. Down goes Frazier. The world saw domination. They saw a giant smashing a legend. They saw a champion humiliated in front of millions. What they did not see was how hard Foreman was breathing between knockdowns. What they did not see was the flicker of disbelief in his eyes every time Frazier got back up. Behind the violence of that night, was a moment that Foreman never forgot. Even beaten, even dazed, even knocked down repeatedly by a man much bigger and stronger, Joe Frazier kept rising. To the crowd, it looked like Foreman had proven his invincibility. To Foreman, it felt like he had looked directly at something frightening, a fighter who refused to surrender, a man who absorbed the worst that power could deliver and still tried to push forward. When the referee stopped the fight, Foreman raised his hands because that is what winners do. Inside, he felt something very different. Not celebration, not triumph, something closer to unease. Fans replayed the knockdowns for decades, Frazier falling, Foreman towering, the puncher made into a monster, and the champion turned into a victim. But only the two men in that ring understood the deeper truth. The humiliation the world saw was not the whole story. Frazier suffered publicly, Foreman suffered privately. One man carried the bruises on his face. The other carried the memory that no matter how many times he dropped Joe Frazier, the man kept standing. The fight ended that night in Jamaica. The consequences did not. In the years that followed Kingston, the public believed the rivalry between George Foreman and Joe Frazier had already been decided. One man rose. One man fell. One became a symbol of unstoppable power. The other became a reminder of what happens when that power lands clean. Fans replayed the knockdowns endlessly. Commentators repeated the same lines. Every documentary echoed the humiliation. Down goes Frazier became a sentence attached to Joe's name for the rest of his life. But rivalries do not disappear simply because the camera moves on. For both men, the aftermath of Jamaica turned into a long and complicated shadow. Frazier felt the humiliation in ways the public never understood. He had been the champion who beat Muhammad Ali. He had carried the pride of Philadelphia. He had risen from nothing and built himself into one of the most relentless fighters in history. Yet after 1973, he could not escape the image of falling again and again under Foreman's fists. It affected how people spoke to him, how reporters framed his legacy, how younger fighters viewed him, and it cut deeply. Joe Frazier was a man who lived with intensity, and humiliation was a wound that stayed open for decades. Foreman lived with a different kind of burden. He went on to defend his title and continued destroying opponents, but the memory of Frazier rising repeatedly never left him. He would later admit that something changed inside him that night. The fear he carried into the ring had not disappeared with victory. It had grown. Because if a man could take that much punishment and still get up, then what human limit truly existed? Foreman became more aggressive in the ring, more angry, more cruel than he wanted to be. Success did not bring peace, brought more questions. Their rematch in 1976 did nothing to ease the tension. Foreman won again, and once again, Frazier refused to quit until his corner threw in the towel. Fans saw a second defeat. Foreman saw something much more unsettling. Frazier still would not break. He could be beaten. He could not be erased. That truth lodged itself into Foreman's mind for years afterward. As time passed, both men struggled with their identities. Frazier grew bitter at how the world remembered him. Foreman grew bitter at what the world assumed he felt. People treated Jamaica as a clean victory. He knew it was not clean at all. It haunted him. It shaped him. It changed the way he looked at his own strength. Privately, he admitted that Joe Frazier was the only opponent who ever forced him to confront fear. Decades after the fight, long after both men retired, the rivalry remained alive between them. Not through words, not through public statements. Through the simple fact that neither man ever forgot what the other revealed about him. A rivalry that began in the ring had become something that lived in memory, in pride, and in wounds neither man fully healed. As George Foreman entered the final stage of his life, the image the public held of him was gentle. The smiling preacher, the television personality, the man who sold grills and quoted scripture and spoke about second chances. People admired how he had changed. They loved the transformation, but inside his mind the past never softened. Age does not erase the memories that shape a fighter. It only removes the noise that once covered them. When everything else slows down, the truth becomes louder. And for Foreman, that truth always led him back to Joe Frazier. In the quiet of those later years, he spoke more about feelings than about victories. He talked about fear in ways he never would have admitted as a young champion. He talked about pressure, about the loneliness of walking into a ring knowing one mistake could end everything. His children heard stories they had never heard before. Stories about the men who had truly changed him. Not the ones he beat quickly. Not the ones he dominated. The ones who stayed in his mind for decades. And Joe Frazier was always at the center of those memories. Foreman often described the night in Kingston with a tone that surprised younger listeners. They assumed he relished it. They assumed any fighter would be proud of such a dramatic victory. But when the man himself spoke, the pride was missing. What replaced it was something closer to unease. He remembered the sound of Frazier breathing after each knockdown. He remembered the look in Frazier's eyes as he stood back up. He remembered how the punches landed, and how they were not enough to keep the man down the way people expected. Foreman said he had met something in that ring that frightened him deeply. Not a punch, not a tactic, a will that refused to break no matter how much punishment it took. As his health declined, the emotional distance between past and present disappeared. He revisited every moment with the clarity that only comes when time is running out. He talked about how the rivalry with Frazier shaped him far more than the world ever understood. He spoke about how victory can create its own kind of pain. The public saw a champion celebrating. Foreman felt the weight of what it meant to beat a man who embodied everything he feared most. Power can destroy, but courage can haunt. In one of his final evenings with his son, he admitted that he had kept much of this inside for years. He said that what happened in Jamaica followed him not because of the victory, but because of the man he fought. A man who reminded him that greatness is not measured by strength. It is measured by the moments when strength fails and the fighter keeps getting up. Those were the memories that returned to George Foreman as his life reached its final quiet stretch. And those were the memories he was finally ready to explain. In the final conversations between George Foreman and his son, the tone shifted into a place he had rarely allowed himself to go. Foreman had spoken publicly for years about redemption, forgiveness, and spiritual rebirth. But the truth that lived inside him was not built entirely on peace. Some memories cannot be softened. Some opponents cannot be turned into friendly stories for interviews. When the time came to speak honestly, Foreman finally allowed himself to admit what Joe Frazier had represented to him for more than 5 decades. He told his son that the world never understood the fear he carried into the ring that night in Kingston. People saw a giant destroying a champion. They never saw the possibility that lived in Foreman's mind. The possibility that if Frazier ever planted his feet and landed one clean left hook, the entire fight could turn. Foreman explained that Joe Frazier was the only opponent who made him feel the danger of being exposed. Not exposed physically. Exposed as a man who might not be the unstoppable force the world believed he was becoming. He said that fear shaped the violence of the fight. Then he revealed something even more unexpected. He admitted that while the world remembers the knockdowns, the moment he remembers most was watching Frazier rise after the first one. Foreman said that when Frazier stood up, something inside him cracked. He realized that he was not fighting a normal man. He was fighting someone whose pride and will were deeper than anything he had faced before. Every time Frazier climbed back to his feet, Foreman felt a surge of panic that he hid behind his expressionless stare. He told his son that the punches became harder, not out of dominance, but out of desperation. Foreman also confessed that the aftermath never felt like triumph. He said he spent years trying to understand why the victory tormented him more than any loss in his career. Eventually, he accepted the truth. Beating Joe Frazier did not make him feel powerful. It made him feel responsible for the suffering of a man he had quietly respected from the beginning. A man who had grown up poor, fought through hardship, and earned everything with relentless determination. Foreman admitted he resented Frazier because he saw in him the qualities he feared he did not have. In a soft voice, he told his son that Frazier was the fighter who stayed in his mind long after the cheers faded. He said, "Courage is not measured by how many opponents you defeat, but by how many times you stand up when defeat seems certain." And in that measure, Joe Frazier was the strongest man he ever met. Foreman ended the confession with a line his son would never forget. He said he had spent his life being called the monster of Kingston, but the only man he ever feared was the one who kept getting up. Joe Frazier passed away in 2011. The boxing world mourned him, remembered him, honored him, yet even in death, the same highlight followed every tribute. The knockdowns in Kingston, the night he fell 6 times, the moment that shaped how younger generations saw him. What most people forgot was everything beyond that moment. They forgot the man who had beaten Muhammad Ali. They forgot the engine of pressure that forced giants backward. They forgot the courage that refused to break. Frazier carried the humiliation publicly, but he also carried a truth the world rarely acknowledged. He had risen each time. No matter how many times he fell, he stood again. George Foreman lived many years after Frazier. He built a new life, created a new identity, and became a symbol of reinvention. To millions, he was the friendly champion who spoke about faith and forgiveness. But in private conversations, he never escaped the gravity of one rivalry that had shaped him more than the belts he won or the victories he collected. Even as time softened his edges, he still remembered the feeling of throwing everything he had at a man who would not stay down. He remembered the fear of seeing Frazier rise again. And he remembered the guilt that followed the celebration the world expected from him. When Foreman finally shared his truth with his son, it reframed everything. The rivalry that the public understood as domination was in reality a collision of two men carrying their own burdens. Frazier battled humiliation. Foreman battled the memory of hurting someone he respected more than he ever admitted. Their legacies became intertwined. One could not be told without the other. And the deeper meaning of their rivalry never lived in the knockouts. It lived in the silent respect that remained long after the gloves were hung up and the arenas went dark. In the end, Foreman's final message carried the weight of a lifetime. He said, "Greatness is not measured by the power to knock someone down. Greatness is measured by the heart it takes to rise again." Joe Frazier lived that truth. George Foreman witnessed it, and history will always connect their names because of it.